Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the virtual launch of the 9th edition of the World Survey on the Role of Women in Development, produced by UN Women, on harnessing social protection for gender equality, resilience, and transformation. The report is a result of contributions from almost 100 experts. It takes stock of gender gaps in social protection systems and shows how they can be better harnessed to transform the lives of women and girls, build resilience, and advance towards more sustainable societies for all. My name is Rebecca Holmes, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. We have a distinguished panel of speakers with us today. But before we go further, and while we wait for more people to join, I will briefly go through some of the housekeeping rules. So the session will be recorded and will be available online afterwards. There are also closed captions available. We're also pleased to be providing simultaneous translation today. Do have a look at the bar at the bottom of your screens to enable translation. And if you have any problems, just let us know in the chat and our social protection colleagues will support you. Please do feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourselves to your fellow colleagues, to share any relevant links or tell us a bit about what you're working on. Please also use the Q&A box in particular to post any questions that you have for the speakers today. Please, when you post your questions, do think about contextualizing your questions and write down who you are directing your question to, because we will collate these for the last part of today's webinar. You'll also see that you can upvote your colleagues' questions if there are particular questions that other people have posted that you would like to be answered. Do feel free also to interact and comment on the session on X. Today's webinar will be organised around a presentation from Silke Staab on the report, and then a panel discussion, followed by an open Q&A session. So please do be thinking about your questions and post them in the Q&A box as we go along. Before formally introducing Silke, we would like to show a short clip from UNICEF's We Deserve Better documentary.
We believe that women and girls demand more and deserve more, going beyond consultation or acknowledgement or sympathy. They demand actions and tangible resources from policymakers, international organizations, and governments.
Can you imagine that if you look at all the girls in the world and compare them with all the boys in the world, the difference in the workload when it comes to unpaid domestic work is 160 million hours. That is a lot.
Social protection needs to be inclusive of women and girls. It needs their involvement to address chronic poverty and to help them manage the risks in their lives to themselves, to their families, and to their communities.
Social protection really contributes to the process of girls and women finding their voices and agency.
Social protection is not charity. It is your right. Demand it and claim it.
What a great clip and video to start us off. I'm now very pleased to introduce Silke Staab. She is a research specialist at UN Women and co-author of several of the organisation's flagship reports, and most recently, Harnessing Social Protection for Gender Equality, Resilience and Transformation, the report that brings us together today. Over to you, Silke.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to present this report here today. The report has been 2 years in the making, and it's benefited from the work and inputs of so many organizations and individuals that I wanted to start out with some acknowledgements. First of all, of the amazing UN Women team that has powered the research, data, and analysis of the report, as well as the design, which we hope you like, including Louis Williams, Laura Turkey, Constanza Tabush, Andra Bat, Brianna Howell, Gergana Tsvetanova, Elisa Acevedo, Claudia Itzkovich, Muyang Wang, and Talita Matos, and many of them are here today, so welcome colleagues as well. Second, as Rebecca mentioned, I wanted to express my gratitude to the almost 100 experts from academia, civil society, and the UN system who have generously shared their research and knowledge during various rounds of consultations. Rebecca and Naila were certainly among the ones who accompanied us from the beginning in this endeavor. And then finally, thanks to the SPIAC-B Gender Working Group chaired by UNICEF and SCDO, which has been a great source of support throughout the process and is also sponsoring the event today. So the report discusses the role of gender-responsive social protection against the backdrop of the multiple cascading crises that have rocked the world over the past years. From COVID-19 to the climate emergency, from financial shocks to violent conflict. Underlying inequalities mean that women and girls, particularly those who are already marginalized, experience the most devastating effects. And as a result, what we've seen is that progress on gender equality and poverty eradication has stalled. Today, 10% of women and girls and just over 9% of men and boys live in households in extreme poverty, and many, many more hover just above the poverty line, struggling with significant hardships. Ongoing conflicts and escalating climate crises are making matters worse. So we know that women and girls in extremely fragile contexts, for example, are 7.7 times more likely to live in extreme poor households than those in non-fragile contexts. And under a worst case climate scenario, up to 158.3 million more women and girls could be pushed into poverty by mid-century. Against this backdrop, the report highlights the enormous potential of social protection for averting further reversals and for putting the SDGs back on track as well in the countdown to 2030. Evidence shows that social protection can protect women and girls against poverty and prevent poverty during times of crises. It can strengthen women's ability to cope with critical life force events like having a child or entering old age. And joined up with gender-responsive employment policies and access to public services like education, health, childcare, and long-term care services, social protection can also promote sustainable pathways out of poverty for women and girls and help transform the norms, structures, and institutions that reproduce their disadvantage and make them more vulnerable to crises and shocks. In the report, we argue that a systems approach that centers the agency and the empowerment of women and girls at every stage of the process, from policy and program design to delivery and financing, is really critical to harnessing this transformative potential of social protection. In reality, however, the potential remains far from being realized. While coverage has increased over the past year, significant gender gaps and biases remain, both in routine social protection systems and in responses to shocks. And we see here on the screen the most recent sex-segregated data from the ILO. In 2023, that data showed for the first time that more than half of the global population was covered by at least one social protection benefit. And that's good news. That's an increase of almost 10 percentage points since 2015. But even so, 2 billion women and girls remain without access to any form of social protection globally. And what is perhaps even more concerning is that gender gaps in social protection coverage, particularly in lower middle income countries, which is what you see on the screen, have actually widened, suggesting that the recent gains in coverage extension have benefited men more than women. And then, of course, with a coverage rate of 8.6% and very little progress since 2015, women in low-income countries are increasingly left behind. In addition to coverage, it's important to point out that even where women do have access to social protection, their benefit levels are very often inadequate. Data from Latin America, for example, shows that 44% of women over the age of 65 do not have sufficient pension income to cover even basic needs, compared to 39% of men of the same age. And we'll hear a bit more about the need of social protection for older women from Sherry-Ann Matthews later today. The neglect of gender-specific risks and vulnerabilities also often worsens during emergencies. So in 2021, UN Women, together with UNDP, analyzed the social protection response to COVID-19, showing that the measures that governments had taken were largely gender blind. And for this report, we replicated this analysis, looking at social protection responses to the cost of living crises. So since 2022, very high levels of inflation, including spiraling food and energy prices, have hit women and low-income households particularly hard. And we see that, again, governments use social protection as an important instrument to respond to these challenges, with nearly 1,000 social protection measures across 171 countries between December 2022 and May 2023. But again, we see that only 21% of these measures were gender sensitive, with 18% explicitly targeting women's economic security, and a mere 3% providing support for unpaid care. Closing these gaps, the report argues, requires action across the whole social protection system, starting with routine, system, and shock responsive program design features, to coordination and integration with other policies, to delivery systems, to adequate financing. And the report dedicates a whole chapter to each of these issues, drawing on the latest evidence and highlighting promising approaches and practices. I won't be able to cover this in any depth here, but I wanted to provide a few top-level highlights across these 5 chapters. So when it comes to closing gender gaps in routine social protection systems, the report highlights the extension of social protection to the world's 740 million women in informal employment, including those in female-dominated occupations, as a key priority. For example, Mexico has recently made progress in bringing domestic workers under social insurance coverage, while Tunisia has adapted its social security laws to become more inclusive of seasonal agricultural workers, many of whom are women. And later today, we'll hear from Lorraine and Florian about specific challenges faced by women street vendors and market traders, which is another group of female-dominated jobs in the informal economy. The report also argues that routine social protection systems must do more to recognize and support unpaid care, and highlights opportunities for doing so across the life course. In addition to the long-term endeavor of building robust gender-responsive social protection systems, there is an urgent need as well to ensure that existing social protection schemes respond better to women's rights and needs during emergencies. This can be done in the context of climate change, for example. We've seen countries like Cameroon, Malawi, and South Sudan combining cash benefits for women with access to climate-resilient agricultural jobs and training. But many of the emerging gender-responsive practices are still quite small scale. In conflict and forced displacement settings, in turn, humanitarian and social protection actors can come together and should come together to address the complex needs of women and girls, including spiraling levels of gender-based violence. And we highlight a good example from a multi-sectoral task force on this in Lebanon in recent years. So these examples already highlight the need for integrated approaches to really maximize gender equality impacts of social protection. And we particularly emphasize links with policies that support women's employment, redistribute unpaid care responsibilities, and address gender-based violence. And we'll hear more about how such links can be made at the level of cash transfer programs from Gloria later today. School feeding programs provide another entry point for improving not only education and nutrition outcomes, especially among girls, but also for promoting women's access to decent jobs. Cambodia's school feeding program, for example, has made important progress in supporting women as suppliers of school food through open procurement and also formalized contracts and payments for cooks, the majority of whom are also women. Implementation and delivery are critical but often neglected aspects of making social protection work for women. And in the report, we argue that delivery is really more than just a series of technical steps related to outreach, enrollment, registration, and disbursement of benefits. It's about people and relationships between social protection recipients and providers, between citizens and the state. And so these relationships matter and are important. For recipients, accessing social protection benefits shouldn't be an obstacle course, but by many women it is indeed experienced as such, particularly when the constraints they face in terms of resources, time, mobility, and access to digital tools and digital literacy are not taken into account. So simplified registration and enrollment procedures are needed to reduce these hurdles, but very often it is frontline social protection workers and or women's organizations on the ground who ensure that benefits reach women and girls who would otherwise remain excluded. And just to give one example, in India, the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, runs community centers that help women and formal workers gain access to social protection. And these centers also served as emergency hubs for the distribution of food kits and cash payments during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, and that's the final chapter of the report as well, the promise of social protection for gender equality stands and falls with adequate financing. So filling the $1.4 trillion financing gap for achieving basic social protection in low and middle income countries is clearly critical. The report shows that all countries can allocate resources to finance gender responsive social protections if the right conditions are created. And that includes at national level the agreement of fiscal pacts between governments and their people to build consensus on taxation and spending priorities and strengthening trust in the state. And at the global level, what we need is really urgently a reform of the international financial architecture to ensure that social protection is not crowded out by spiraling debt interest payments, that resources for social protection are not decimated by tax evasion and avoidance, and that more official development assistance is channeled towards gender responsive social protection. So that's the overview from my part. Thanks so much for listening, and please do take a look at the full report on our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silke, for that excellent presentation of the report, as well as fitting that report and the key messages into the 12 minutes that you had allocated. It's really, a commendable report that you and the team have pulled together in terms of the depth and the breadth of the issues that you've covered, highlighting the progress that has been made. And I really, when reading it, enjoyed the illustrations and the program examples of some of the positive progress that has been made, as well as a really stark and urgent reminder of what else needs to happen and really how far we are from achieving the potential of social protection. With that, I am very pleased to start our panel discussion. We have an excellent lineup of panelists today, as you can see on the screens. We have Naila Kabir, Cherry Ann Matthews, Gloria Reyes Gomez, Florian Jurgens-Grant, and Lorraine Ndufu. And if I can ask you all to put your cameras on if you haven't already to join us for the panel discussion. I will introduce a bit more in detail each panelist as I ask them their question. We have a question for each of them. And there's more information on their bios, which will be shared in the PowerPoint presentation after the webinar. While we go through the panel, please do be thinking about questions that you'd like to ask the panelists and to Silke afterwards. And please do start putting them in the Q&A box, directing them to the speakers as we go ahead. So Naila, I would like to introduce you. It's fantastic having you on the panel. And as Silke said at the beginning, you were part of the advisory board for the report as well. Naila Kabir is Professor of Gender and Development at the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics, LSE. She is also on the faculty of the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. With her extensive expertise on poverty, labour market, social protection and collective action, Naila has also been, as we said, an external advisor for the World Survey report that brings us here today. So Naila, the question to you is, we are at a point in time where the world seems to be reeling from crisis upon crisis, deepening inequalities and injustice, especially for women. In the face of political divisions and the rise of regressive narratives that we're seeing across many contexts, this report by UN Women focuses on the transformative potential of social protection. Could you give us some reflections on what that means to you and the relevance of social protection in this time?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, for that question. Let me start with the issue of the relevance of social protection in this era of polycrisis. As you've said, we've talked about conflicts, pandemics, financial meltdowns, and all the time steadily rising inequalities and acceleration in climate change that is probably going to make this planet unbearable, unlivable in the not too distant future. The regressive narratives that you're talking about are linked to this insecurity. Economic inequality has bred economic insecurity, and in turn, this has bred political divisions and social conservatism, a great deal of which revolves around family and gender relations, and on rolling back some of the gains that women and girls have made on different fronts. The family has been seen as a bastion of security, at least for men, and changes in gender relations appear to be threatening this last bastion. One can understand the anxiety behind this, because men are suffering as well as women. But retreating to the gender inequalities of the past will do little to address the crisis of the present and the future. In fact, we will be better prepared to deal with the crises if all sections of the population, all members of families, are assured of basic livelihood security and access to basic health services, like health, education, and so on, which build their resilience and their capabilities. Now, we know from a growing body of evidence that social protection can lead to this outcome in many different ways. It can have short-term effects, such as providing a safety net when crisis hits, and it can have longer-term effects of allowing people to access livelihood opportunities and basic services to enhance their sense of citizenship, of being a valued member of their community. But this is only a potential, and I think Silke pointed this out. These outcomes are not consistently reported for social protection schemes across the world. And the reason is part of the reason is difference in context, but part of the reason is that they're not always the objective of social protection programs. What this report tells us is that for social protection to have transformative outcomes, the policy processes themselves will have to be transformed. You will not get transformative outcomes with poorly resourced and poorly designed programs. And the report tries to bring together some of the key factors of this transformative process. One is the kind of principles, right? And we talked earlier that social protection is a right, not a commodity, not charity. And that's a political or a normative point. And the second is it needs to be gender responsive. And that is an analytical point. One of the things I get from this report is you have to be proactive and not reactive. The past where you put social safety nets in place after crisis has hit has never functioned very well. What you need is a commitment to transformative outcomes at all stages of the policy process, starting with clarity of objectives in the mission statement to influencing all the different stages like design and so on. And the report makes another, and again, I think Silke mentioned this, that on its own, social protection cannot achieve miracles. What social protection can be most effective is when it is a part of a joined up agenda, which includes social policy, includes macroeconomic policy, includes fiscal space. In terms of the gender responsiveness analytical challenge, I think we know that men and women differ in their access to capabilities, rights, and so on, but women also differ. They differ because of variations of context. They differ of life course variations, much more marked for women than for men. And they differ because gender intersects with other forms of inequality, which often exacerbates the vulnerability of women and girls. And a very important contribution to the report, and one I've mentioned every time I talk about it, is the attention when it talks about implementation, the attention to the implementers, to the people who interact with the community at the interface. Because if you don't treat them with respect and dignity, how will you expect them to pass on respect and dignity through their actions with poor people in the community? And of course, we need methodologies, importantly, to allow us to learn from lessons on the ground. We need methodologies that don't only tell us what worked, what didn't work, but why, how, and for whom. And then finally, I think for transformative social protection, I want to come to this biggest challenge, finance. Finance is a challenge, not because there is not enough wealth in the world. We are wealthier in the world than we've ever been in the past. Finance is a challenge because that wealth remains concentrated in the hands of a very few people, and there seems to be an inexplicable reluctance to ask these people to make a fairer contribution to the collective good. A transformative social protection strategy offers you a very different message, the opposite message. It says that we are all collectively responsible for each other, that our fate is intertwined, and that our interdependence requires that we ensure that everyone has a stake in the common good, so that the costs of rising inequality, the regressive politics that you talked about in the beginning, do not destroy our collective future.
Nyla, thank you so much for those comments. Really important insights from you there. And I really liked what you've just said at the end in terms of flipping that narrative on financing. Really important key takeaway, I think, for all of us to be thinking about. Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce our second panelist, Gloria Reyes Gomez, who is General Director of the Superate Programme, a cash transfer scheme that's highlighted in the World Survey report for its innovative gender-responsive components. Gloria is a lawyer and a former member of the Chamber of Deputies of the Dominican Republic. And Gloria, we'd like to ask you, since you are the director of the programme in the Dominican Republic that's highlighted in the World Survey report as being a promising example of centering the needs of women and girls within social protection, can you tell us more about the programme and its care and gender-based violence components and the importance of these, particularly for adolescent girls?
Muchísimas gracias, muy agradecida de este espacio y honrada de poder compartirlo con tantas personas que juntos luchamos por el avance de las mujeres. En el caso dominicano, el programa Supérate como principal respuesta y estrategia de lucha contra la pobreza ha incluido un componente clave que es el componente de género. Y desde el inicio de nuestro nuevo enfoque transversal de género hemos identificado prioridades para el apoyo de las mujeres que son parte de las beneficiarias. En el caso de nuestra entidad hay 1.500.000 familias recibiendo apoyos directos. Ese 1.500.000 familias tiene un 66% de mujeres jefas de hogar. Entonces debemos, solo por la matrícula de beneficiarios, tener unas políticas priorizadas y por eso el componente de género es tan importante. Lo que hemos logrado es combinar la protección social con la inclusión económica. Hemos procurado unir esas necesidades de garantizar derecho y acceso de recursos y oportunidades a las mujeres con también oportunidades de apoyo y acompañamiento. En el caso del programa de violencia y prevención de la violencia a las mujeres, en combinación con el Ministerio de la Mujer, hemos creado un subsidio especializado para las mujeres que son víctimas de violencia y tienen un apoyo directo mensual a las que están apoyadas en casas de acogida para que en su proceso de salida pues tengan vinculación a actividades productivas, pero también tengan un ingreso asegurado que les permita la libertad y no la vinculación a sus agresores. Este ha tenido un gran impacto, ya tenemos cerca de 1.200 mujeres que son beneficiarias de este tipo de programa. Es un programa nuevo, apenas tiene 2 años y el resultado está siendo muy positivo porque permite que las mujeres no se vinculen una vez más a sus agresores porque tienen las posibilidades económicas. Pero otro de los apoyos interesantes que hemos logrado es el inicio de todo lo que es la protección social, incluyendo el cuidado como uno de sus pilares. El Estado Dominicano desde hace 2 años se ha propuesto diseñar un sistema nacional de cuidados que incluye y prioriza el cuidado domiciliario. Ya con este proyecto, esta nueva política, tenemos cerca de 1.600 personas certificadas como cuidadoras. Ya el cuidado lo tenemos como una profesión, profesionalizado, y justo en este mes comenzamos el cuidado a adultos mayores en las casas de las familias priorizadas de los hogares más pobres de la República Dominicana. Y otro de los elementos que hemos identificado como determinantes en este apoyo a las mujeres es el de acompañar a las niñas en la prevención de embarazos y uniones tempranas. Junto a UNICEF hemos estado trabajando en los últimos 3 años en una metodología que se llama Clubes de Chicas. Es un espacio de acompañamiento socioeducativo para las niñas y a cerca de 5.000 adolescentes han egresado de estos programas, ayudándolas y acompañándolas a que trabajen proyectos de vida, sus mapas de sueños, tienen psicólogas, mentoras, y este es uno de los principales elementos que nos está ayudando a reducir pobreza femenina. En el 2023 logramos una reducción de 5 puntos en la pobreza femenina, pasando de un 29 a un 24%. Ya para 2024, la pobreza en República Dominicana se está situando en el 19% aproximadamente. O sea, venimos desde la pandemia reduciendo pobreza 27%, los números de 2021 hasta ahora, a principios de año, 19%, y en gran medida tiene que ver con la focalización en estas políticas dirigidas a trabajar en el apoyo y el empoderamiento de las mujeres. Solo 2 datos adicionales para que también tengamos una idea del enfoque económico de complementario de la protección social. En el caso de la microfinanciera gubernamental, se llama Promipyme, el 61% de los microfinanciamientos y los pequeños financiamientos son otorgados a mujeres emprendedoras, y una gran parte de ellas son mujeres beneficiarias de los programas sociales que se capacitan, crean sus pequeños emprendimientos y son apoyadas y apoyados con estos financiamientos blandos que dispone el Estado Dominicano. Y con relación a las cifras de empleo, es importante destacar que el empleo formal creció en las mujeres en 2013 en un 7.1%. Así que esa combinación, como decía la señora Naila, de tener, por un lado, la protección social garantizada como un derecho, con una amplia cobertura, pero por otro lado también el fortalecimiento o la inclusión económica de las mujeres con empleos formales, con aumento de salarios mínimos y con un enfoque que empodere económicamente a las mujeres, yo entiendo que es la fórmula que nos está permitiendo reducir pobreza femenina y presentar estos indicadores que definitivamente comienzan a impactar la vida de las mujeres dominicanas. Lo dejo hasta aquí para cualquier otra pregunta. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Gloria. It was really interesting to hear kind of the practical examples of addressing sort of the multiple needs of adolescent girls and women through social protection in combination with other services and interventions as well. And I think also the important point that you're raising, and as Naila also suggested and talked about, was the importance of monitoring these impacts as well, in order to be able to understand what the progress is of different interventions. So thank you very much, Gloria, for those discussion points. I'd now like to introduce our next panelist, Lorraine Njovu, who unfortunately can't join us in person today, but she has sent a video intervention, which we're very pleased to share. So Lorraine is the current president of the Zimbabwe Chamber of Informal Economy Associations and StreetNet International, a global alliance that represents over 700,000 informal traders across more than 50 countries. What we are asking Lorraine to respond to and to talk to us about is that one of the key recommendations of the World Survey report is to extend social protection to women informal workers. And we'll hear from Lorraine about the challenges that women street vendors face in accessing social protection and the specific provisions that these workers are advocating for.
Good day, everyone. My name is Lorraine Ndlovu. I'm president of StreetNet International. StreetNet International is a global alliance of street and market vendors, which works in more than 50 countries with over 62 organizations that work with workers in the informal economy. As workers in the informal economy, there is a dominance of women in the sector, and with that dominance of women, there is also a high rate of vulnerability and also lack or very little social protection. This affects women widely, especially because women have special needs such as maternity health and maternity benefits. Maternity benefits also include the access to maternity leave, which women in the informal economy do not have. They can be pregnant until the last day when they go into labor. They will still be in the market or in the street doing their usual business until on the day that they give birth. And as soon as the baby is out, in 2 weeks' time, they are back again because they have to leave. It's a daily thing that they have to make a living and buy food for the day or support their families on a daily basis. This is the biggest challenge that we encounter as women. And this means that when women go back to work with their little babies, these little babies have no way of getting any quality childcare at all because of the vulnerability of the mother, which is then passed directly to the baby. As soon as the baby sees daylight, they are immediately introduced to being a very vulnerable person, plagued with so many injustices and inequalities. And having said that, we are also, as StreetNet International, advocating for the expansion of social protection to workers in the informal economy. In our advocacy, we have a platform of demands on social protection. Our demands include legal frameworks. We want to see legal frameworks which speak to the expansion of social protection to workers in the informal economy, particularly street vendors and market vendors. Secondly, we want to see a financing of social protection, which includes these workers in the informal economy. States should make it a priority that they allocate finances to the expansion of social protection. Thirdly, we want to see a governance of which prioritizes social protection schemes. And we also want to see a design of social protection schemes which are inclusive of workers in the informal economy. Lastly, it would mean nothing if we see legal frameworks being put in place, finances being allocated, designs of social protection schemes being done, and governance taking into consideration the inclusion of informal economy workers. If all this is not implemented, we would like to see an implementation of these inclusive social protection schemes. And once we have seen that implementation, we believe that this is going to go a long way in also ensuring that there is decent work in the informal economy, of which social protection is a key tenet. I believe that once we see a semblance of decent work in the informal economy, this means that we are already moving towards meaningful transitioning of the informal economy to formality. Because we believe that there is no transitioning which can happen if there is no access to basic human rights such as social protection, the right to organize, rights as workers, whether formal or informal, should be part of the deal when we speak about transformation or transitioning to formality. I believe that having said this, as we continue to work, advocate, and call for expansion of social protection to the informal economy, we shall see a decrease in the vulnerability of women, we shall see a decrease in the vulnerability of children, and we shall see better lives, decency, and dignity for all workers in the informal economy. No one else can do this other than the affected. So the workers themselves have got to be involved, they have to be consulted, they have to be very much part of all the processes of calling and also speaking to the expansion of social protection to the informal economy. Organizations of workers in the informal economy should, together with their members, set an agenda and strategies of engagement and ultimately achieving the expansion of social protection. The expansion cannot be achieved if we do not talk to government, if we do not speak to trade unions and other stakeholders. I believe that governments are a key stakeholder to engage because they are the very custodians of all citizens in all their countries. And informal economy workers, street vendors and market vendors are very much legal citizens of their countries. With that being said, we continue to say nothing can be for us without us. If we sit at the table, contribute solutions which can be applied to the challenges that we have, definitely sustainable solutions will be found. And it is my call to all the participants, delegates who are here, to engage more on issues of informality. Informal economy workers are human, and thus their issues are issues of human rights. Social protection should be a basic right for everyone, regardless of the sector in which they work. Whether they are formal or informal is secondary, especially for women. Women continue to grow nations by giving birth to children, and those children should not be robbed of their rights the minute they see daylight. Children have a right to play. Children have a right to development which does not segregate them from the day that they are born. We need childcare centers in markets, childcare centers which are affordable and provide quality childcare. Involving workers and mothers will make this an achievable dream. Thank you very much for inviting us to this forum. I am really honored to have been able to put the voice of the informal economy workers in this forum. I wish you all fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful to hear from Lorraine through the video and highlighting the importance of the life course, thinking about intergenerational issues, and of course, the importance of workers' organisations and civil society being part of the process for solutions on social protection. Now, our next panellist is Florian Jürgens-Grant. He is the Global Social Protection Advisor at Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organising, WIGO, a global research and advocacy network on informal employment. Florian will provide additional insights, building on Lorraine's intervention, and will also be available for questions from the audience concerning social protection for women informal workers. Florian, WIGO works closely with organisations of women informal workers, such as StreetNet. In addition to what we heard from Lorraine, what are some of WIGO's key asks when it comes to the extension of social protection to women informal workers?
Thanks, Rebecca, and great to be here. And maybe just to say that while globally men are slightly more likely to be informally employed, in low and middle income countries, the majority of informal workers are women, or informal workers are disproportionately female. And very importantly, within the informal economy, women workers tend to be in more vulnerable forms of informal employment. There's great diversity in informal employment, and women tend to be on the lower end of the earning spectrum within informality and in more vulnerable versions of informal work. So that's very important. And I think that means that our collective failure of closing the missing middle coverage gaps that we have in social protection systems disproportionately affects informal women workers. And who tend to be often excluded from very narrowly poverty-targeted social protection, but also at the same time excluded from rigidly social insurance linked to formal employment. So women workers are really falling through the cracks of many countries' social protection systems. And closing that missing middle coverage gaps requires, in WIGO's view, reforms to essentially, both social protection systems and both the tax and the contribution financing, but also greater coordination across governments, particularly with health and care systems. So what we're calling for, together with organizations like StreetNet, but also other organizations of informal workers in different sectors, would be, expanding tax-financed universal, crucially important for women workers who will have spent much of their time outside of formal labor markets and therefore regularly excluded from social insurance. We think it's also hugely important to invest and think about adapting occupational safety and health provisions to the realities of women workers, in markets where StreetNet, organizations linked to StreetNet are represented. That's really important. But in addition to tax financing and the social assistance side, which needs to be expanded, we also think as women informal workers, as workers, they have a right to access social insurance as well as all workers. Social insurance is where most employment-related, working age-relevant contingencies are covered. Unemployment issues, employment injury, disability and pension benefits beyond tax financing tend to be found on the contributory side, certainly at higher levels. And so it is crucial for us that these systems are adapted to be more inclusive, more accessible, more affordable, more in line with the demands of women workers. And finally, as part of that, the reason why we think it's so important to enable the integration of women workers into social insurance systems is that the alternative to that, as it is being promoted by some international organizations, are essentially very individualistic kind of savings accounts, and those don't have the capacity to redistribute, to share risks, to recognize care responsibilities that women workers often have, to ensure minimum adequate benefits, which you can find in public social insurance systems. and therefore making these schemes more inclusive, more affordable, and more in line with the needs that women workers face in their day-to-day lives is hugely important. And of course, none of that will happen or is going to happen in the way that it should without the strong and equitable and inclusive participation of women workers in their organizations. So we really need inclusive social dialogue in driving these agendas forward. And those social dialogues really need to include the many women-led organizations of informal workers that exist. So that's hugely important. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Florian. It's really important highlighting sort of the occupational health issues as well as the financing. Again, this is a strong theme which is coming through, but also like the point about social insurance and thinking about the kind of the different types of social protection programs and interventions which are really needed to meet informal workers' needs. I also hope that you get a few questions in the Q&A so that you can expand on some of those things because you've had a shorter time than others. And with that, please, audience members, do feel free to put in the Q&A box any questions that you would like answered. We've got an allocated time in a few minutes to talk through some of the questions. So please do keep thinking and putting them in the Q&A box. And finally, our panelist is Cherian Matthews. We're very pleased to have you here. He is the Chief Executive of HelpAge International, leading the organisation's global work alongside the HelpAge Global Network, pursuing the policy agenda on population ageing and promoting the rights of older people, especially looking at intersectionality with gender, disability and climate change. And Cherian, we've now heard from Gloria with a focus on adolescent girls and Lorraine and Florian with a focus on women in the world of work. And we'd like to ask you your perspective on the importance of social protection for older women. How are the findings of the World Survey report relevant for women as they age? And based on HelpAge's research, what do you understand about older women's experiences in accessing social protection?
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that question. And also, hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank UN Women and all the organizers for inviting me to join this panel. It's a privilege to be here today to advance our dialogue on the topic of gender equality and social protection based on the fantastic report that Silke and the team has produced, World Survey Report. At the heart of HelpAge International's work on gender equality are the voices of older women. We listen to their experiences and work with them and our network members to promote their well-being and empowerment. And from HelpAge's work, we know that older women's experiences can only be fully understood if we look back at the experiences throughout their lives. An older woman from Zimbabwe told us that to achieve equality, a woman's dignity and integrity must be maintained throughout the course of their life. Poverty in old age is a critical risk that has a strong gender dimension. As people age, we know their sources of income tend to diminish. The gendered roles that women undertake, as well as the risk, inequalities, and discrimination that women face over the life course make them less likely than men to experience income security and enjoy economic independence as they age. The SDG Gender Snapshot produced by UN Women in 2023 highlighted that poverty and income insecurity disproportionately affect older women compared to older men due to lifelong inequalities. This includes disproportional care responsibilities, working in informal economies, as we just heard, and gender-based discrimination in the workplace. Despite the strong need to support older women and their economic empowerment, older women are generally sidelined. An analysis conducted by HelpAge International showed that only 0.01% of OECD-DAC donors spent on gender equality includes older women. Social protection systems play a critical role in protecting older women. their income security, and enabling a life of dignity and well-being in old age. Stable income source through pension offers older women not only an ability to meet their needs, starting from the most basic ones like buying food and medicine. Our research shows that social protection makes them feel more empowered, improves their self-esteem, and makes them feel better equipped to cope with shocks. In recent research, an older woman in Bangladesh told us that the first time she withdrew old age allowance from bank and held the money in her hands, she felt extremely proud. Yet, a lifetime of inequality and discrimination at all levels, from the workplace to the household, adds up to the inadequate social protection in old age. The World Survey report tells us that 44% of women aged 65 years and over do not have sufficient pension income to cover basic needs. As they age, women have less income from contributory pension benefits, less savings, and less assets compared to men. As highlighted in the report, around 29% of women compared to 49% of men globally contribute to a pension scheme. This is a stark difference, helping us understand how life course experiences have profound implications in old age. This also highlights the essential nature of universal non-contributory pensions or social pensions to protect older people as they age, alongside contributory pensions. HelpAge through the global network has been strongly promoting the adoption of universal social pensions across the globe. The introduction of social pensions over the years across many countries has enabled some expansion in the coverage for older women. However, our work shows that more efforts are needed across nations given the significant gaps in coverage and insufficient levels of the benefits, especially for older women to lead a dignified life. I would like to highlight that the way social protection policies and programs are delivered also matters. This has been highlighted in the report itself. As the report shows, in line with research conducted by HelpAge recently, the delivery of social protection can have a substantial influence on the experience of older women. This includes aspects such as accessing information, registration and enrollment, delivering payments, and grievance and redressals. An example is the use of digital payments as a part of the implementation of social protection program. In our recent research, we heard from some older women that they are confronted with a material risk of financial abuse due to gaps in access to technologies and their own digital skills as they rely on male family members to access the funds. Our research also shows that community-level initiatives, for instance, through older people associations, can be very beneficial by offering information on how to access social protection mechanisms and by facilitating direct payments to older women. Let us work together and reinforce the commitment to strengthen social protection systems that effectively respond to the needs of all women across the life course, including older women, in an inclusive and participatory way. Our starting point should be the development of a deep understanding of their needs, of experience of intersectional nature, of life course dynamics. We can listen more directly to older women's own voices, learn from their lived experiences, and involve them and their communities in making social protection systems more gender responsive and inclusive. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Cherry, and that was really useful and insightful, and really important to bring back sort of the whole cycle of the life course and really highlighting some of the challenges that older women face, the kind of sidelining, as you mentioned, of older women's needs, but really highlighting the importance of social protection systems and programs to understand what those needs are and to identify where those gaps are in terms of adequacy and coverage and comprehensiveness. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists, especially for keeping well on time. I'm very impressed. And maybe I can just take a couple of minutes for myself just to offer some reflections on what we've been hearing. today through Silke's presentation and also the panelists' interventions. And a few things have really sort of stood out to me across the discussion. One of these is, and it's not new to anybody, but I think always worth reiterating, is that well-designed and implemented social protection at its core has a strong impact on reducing women and girls' poverty, on addressing their needs, supporting livelihoods, and critically building resilience to shocks, especially for the poorest populations, and especially in the context of the multiple crises, often long-term protracted crises that many of the poorest are living in. And that scaling up coverage and supporting emerging social protection systems, even in the context of crises, is absolutely critical. Another point that I think has been really well articulated and made across the presentations and discussions today is the importance of intentional design and implementation to meet objectives, especially when it comes to gender equality outcomes, and that this is absolutely crucial. That harnessing this transformative potential of social protection won't just automatically happen, but it requires really centering issues and principles of dignity, of empowerment, of agency, and the visibility and hearing the voices of people who are recipients of social protection across all social protection system functions, from sort of policy development to influencing discussions on financing to program design and implementation. Maybe I can also take this opportunity just to highlight some of the work that we've also been doing through STAR, which is an FCDO-funded technical assistance facility on social protection. And we've been supporting governments, development partners, and civil society actors to help identify where those gaps are in gender-responsive social protection systems and providing technical assistance through various mechanisms, including research, capacity building, networking, to strengthen social protection systems and programs to better meet the needs of women and girls, and working alongside with the numerous organisations and research and implementation work that is already going on. And finally, I think another key point for me was that a life course approach to social protection really requires this broader thinking, collective action, and collaboration across various actors and organisations. And I really liked how today's panelists represented the different stages in the life course. And bringing these together in this webinar shows how important it is to think of the different needs at different stages of life, but also the different types of interventions beyond cash transfers, which are needed. And really highlighting the importance of working in coordination and collaboration across civil society, across government and development partners. And this is really critical in maximising efficiencies and also supporting sort of the contributions of each of these organisations in order to meet those life cycle needs. Now, I hope everybody has had an opportunity to put some questions into the Q&A box, and please do feel free to keep them coming. So we have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so for questions. So I can see that there are a few in here. So maybe let me just start from the top. And Florian, there is a question for you. If you could expand a bit more on the range and types of interventions and services that are most needed for supporting the livelihoods of women informal workers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. It's also a very broad one. When we talk about informal workers, that's 2 billion people. There's such diversity, of course, according, by gender, by other types of identities, and but I think almost as importantly by sector, right? So there's domestic workers, there's street vendors, there's home-based workers, a part of kind of garment chains, and a lot of what needs to be done in order to improve their years about livelihoods, but I think their situation and their livelihoods, I think, will depend on their specific sector and their specific location. What I think we can say is that there's a big role for social protection in terms of protecting against risks that they face, economic life cycle risks. We also know that the lack of childcare in particular is a huge barrier for women informal workers to essentially access more decent, more productive work. So the lack of childcare is a big barrier to that. But there's other areas as well. If we go beyond social protection, there's, for instance, it's important to recognize that they often pay taxes at the local municipal level in fees, and that's not often part of tax conversations. And there can be a risk that we don't recognize that, and then kind of keep burdening them with more and more taxation. In street vendors, access to markets, both physical markets and the right to the city and the right to engage in their livelihoods without harassment from authorities and confiscation of their goods and wares. That's a big risk. So there's a real kind of urban policy, a whole set of urban policies that are important for informal workers. These things have access to credit and that's other kinds of business support. I think is an important one, but maybe just a final thing to say, when we picture informal workers, informal women workers, we always assume that they're very much one-person units, kind of self-employed, entrepreneurial. But I think we also have to recognize that informal workers, women informal workers, are part of larger value chains, right? So they might work in the garment sector at the kind of the very bottom of the food chain, if you will, or they might be part of other types of other types of value or production chains. And it's really important to recognize that lots of their well-being and livelihoods are determined by these power relationships in these larger economic systems of dependency. And one important way of improving their situation is to support their organization and their power building in trying to renegotiate some of those harmful systems that they're integrated in. So I think there's things we can do on the social protection level, on the individual level, of course, but there's also more kind of structural and systemic things we need to do in order to improve the economic situation, but of course all the things that flow from that. It's complicated. It's very, very diverse, of course.
That's great. Thank you so much for that response, Florian. And there are a few more questions in the chat. So let me move on. And I think this is probably addressed to Cherian. So how can we address the intersectional challenges faced by older women, such as poverty, violence, and lack of access to healthcare through or in the context of social protection?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's a very big one, to be frank. As we all should imagine that, when it comes to the older women or older people, they are invisible during the crises. And our first starting point is to create an awareness about the issue itself. And we quite often strongly believe that the agency is important, that their voices are important. So how do we bring in their voices? How do we bring their agency to ensure that in conflict or crisis situation, their voices are heard and they are listened to? I mean, that's the first and foremost fundamental aspect, because we are present in most of the conflict situations as well as crisis. Whenever there is a crisis, we are there. And our network members really work with the older people, especially older women, to make sure that they stand up and their voices are made clear to the policymakers. That is one aspect. The second aspect, I think, wherever we could, I think you pointed out a very good question about the health, the link with health and income. It's so critical in the old age, and we also see that at the national level, wherever health insurance, for example, health insurance are available. So how do we connect the older persons with health insurance coverage, for instance? So these are some of the things that we do, but I think it's more important that how their voices are listened to especially by the policymakers, and really make sure that they are kind of a supporter to various social protection mechanisms at various stages. Again, the life course is so important because the vulnerabilities that experience as adults and girls are exacerbated when it comes to the old age. So we need to make sure that we have a much more a comprehensive approach to social protection mechanisms, so that we can avoid the old age kind of challenges as we speak.
Thank you very much, Cherian, for that. See, we've got another couple of questions which have sort of partly been answered in the chat, but it would be great to hear a bit more in terms of the responses. I wondered if, Silke, you would be able to just provide a bit of reflections or expansion on a couple of the questions that you've received in the chat. In terms of what works around shifting narratives, attitudes, and decision making. And another question from the chat was around whether you included East Africa region in your study area and thinking about comparisons across other contexts and other continents.
Yeah, sure. We've answered those questions in the chat, but obviously there's also a word limit, so not able to go into that much detail. Maybe just on the question of shifting narratives and political economy, that's a really, really good question. I think political economy studies do exist, but they often don't look at the gendered dynamics of actually integrating gender into social protection systems. So I think there's definitely scope for more research on that. The report, I think, provides arguments for challenging two more overarching narratives that I think are harmful for women and that are, stand in the way of gender responsive social protection. On the one hand, it's these narratives around poverty basically being the fault of poor people, and all that is needed is they pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and everything will be fine. And in that sense, social protection is really just a handout or something to help them along the way. And I think that is something that is really important to challenge and to insist that poverty is a result of structural inequalities and reproduced by those very inequalities, and that it is a violation of people's right to an adequate standard of living. And social protection is a key tool and a right that these people should have access to. But going beyond that, what I wanted to add maybe to what is in the chat, one of the things that we did in the report that I thought was novel and interesting is that we actually looked at poverty dynamics over time. And so we worked with Vidya Divakar from IDS and CPAN to look at panel studies that show how people fare over various survey waves in Bangladesh, Tanzania, and Peru. And what she found is actually, yes, of course, there is kind of an element of chronic poverty of people that remain in poverty over survey rounds. But there is a huge proportion of people who move in and out of poverty constantly. And those people are very often missed by very narrowly targeted social protection schemes. And that is even more relevant in the context of the repeated shocks and cascading crises that we're seeing now. There are life course shocks, right, that also are visible in that study. Adding a child to the household often, is a trigger of downward poverty mobility, but so are exogenous shocks. And so I think as we see more shocks, these narrowly targeted programs are not able to respond to the dynamism that we see in poverty. And the data also shows that women and women-headed households are more profoundly affected by those shocks. So they experience them in a similar kind of quantity and frequency, but they lose more. So a higher proportion of women, for example, report losing both income and assets as opposed to just one of the two, etc. So I think that's important. And then the second narrative we challenge, and we've challenged for a long time, is to see social protection spending as simply consumption spending, and something that goes out there and is then lost, and instead see social protection as an investment, not only in people's capabilities, but also, as Naila said at the beginning, in kind of broader societal well-being and reduced inequalities that are in everyone's interest in the end, for all of us to be able to live together peacefully, and for everyone to benefit. And then final point I wanted to make is to really how can we not reinforce unpaid care as a female responsibility? I think very basically, and that refers to social protection and public services and investments in infrastructure, is to make it a collective responsibility. It's to say that this is a societal responsibility. We need taxes to fund social protection that supports unpaid care. We need taxes to fund public services that redistribute care away from families towards the state, social protection policies that redistribute care between women and men, etc.
Thank you, Silke, for that. It was nice, comprehensive, and expanding on the questions that you answered in the chat or in the Q&A box. I wondered if I could also just maybe ask sort of similar question to Naila in terms of, your experience of sort of advocating for gender responsive, gender transformative social protection in the context of these kind of, tricky environments, like constrained contexts and sort of attitudes. What's your experience been of that? And if I could also just tag on an additional question to you, Naila, which is, so you touched upon in when you sort of had your response in the panel about the role of implementers and whether you'd be able to talk a little bit more and expand a little bit on that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. I think, a lot of the arguments we make around social protection, gender responsive social protection, the importance of the transformative potential. And it's a potential because it is only realized when the design and the intentionality of programs are in place. But we're relying a lot on evidence, right? We want to show that in different places, these are the kinds of impacts that social protection has. And I think for me, what has been very interesting is the fact that social protection programs report very different kinds of impacts in different parts of the world. But the very presence of the promise of protection can have an independent impact. So for instance, if people see that, redistribution of measures, the food distribution system in India actually addresses hunger, then they are likely to mobilize to lobby for it. So social protection can have a life of its own, which goes beyond its immediate impact to the promise that it holds out to people. That, as an elderly person, I can rely on some degree of security in my old age. I don't have to rely on, my children being dutiful and so on. So for me, I think the challenge has always been, first of all, to understand these impacts, but to go beyond direct impacts and to make the argument about potential impacts, the way in which, civil society in India got together to argue for taking the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme and making it a national program at a time when it was like about turning swords into plowshares. There was threat of conflict, there was the Maoist, the Naxalite movements, and it seemed like providing this security of livelihood would actually, in a sense, deter conflict. And to some extent, I think it did. So I think for the arguments that I think the report is making, we're all making, is that there is nothing automatic about the impacts of social protection, but there is something learnable about how you can do it better in order to go beyond the immediate short-term impact to the more systemic, changes that can take place over time. So I think that's the argument that we're all engaged in at the moment. To get policy, Silke was talking about not treating poor people as though it's their own fault that they become poor. I think policymakers underestimate the impact of economic insecurity. And economic insecurity leads people into conflict, and maybe social protection comes in too late. So I think that's a very, that's the challenge that we're facing. And it's a challenge we're facing in order to make social protection systems become a part of the normal, everyday ways in which states do their business. And also what I think is very important is the fact that we can show that these impacts include both impacts in the economic domain, livelihood security, social domain about access to services, and political domain about knowing that you matter in that society. And I think your point about, the point about implementation is, I'm was very interested in a study done of GRAT's asset transfer program, which was an asset livelihoods transfer program with savings added. It was a plus program, but also coaching, mentoring. So you're working with people to help them over a period of time to understand. And this program had very different outcomes in impact in different parts. In fact, even within the West Bengal context, the impacts were very different. And one important difference between them was the kind of people that were delivering the program. So in one part of West Bengal, it was a microfinance organization with very little experience of the nurturing that is needed to help people who have no certainty about their future to take up livelihoods. The other program was an organization that worked with self-help groups. And the difference in the outcomes reflected, I think, the difference in how people talked about staff. So I think, this is a point made in the report, that this is not a technical exercise. These are people interacting with people. One set of people have the power to give services or deny services. The other set of people need them. That interaction contains within it the seeds of possible how people imagine themselves. Do they imagine themselves as recipients of charity? Do they imagine themselves as holders of rights? And I think treating the providers well also would make the whole area and social protection is often about care, it's often about health. And often relies on voluntary work by very poorly paid, recognized women. And so you're giving a message out to people that this is not valuable work. So I think the focus in this report on investing, not just in the wages, but giving them decent wages, but also in the respect and dignity of the people who are providing services, has very important ramifications for the people who are receiving them.
Thank you, Naila. You're absolutely critical to be thinking about the whole process, including the workers and the implementers themselves. There was another question in the chat, which I do see has sort of been answered, but I wondered if I could just ask perhaps Florian and Silke, since you've started answering it, to reflect on it. And it links back to something that Naila was just saying around sort of the links between social protection and sort of economic insecurity and conflict. And so the question from Leah is whether there is evidence around social protection supporting social cohesion and conflict prevention. Florian, can I ask that to you first and then see if Silke would like to come in with any additions?
Yeah, happy to. I think it's a really important question. And I put in the chat a piece of research we did actually when I worked for Charian at HelpAge a couple of years ago, where we looked at the evidence of social protection systems and how they impact post-conflict rehabilitation. So we looked at places like Nepal and Timor-Leste and how they've used strategically, particularly very inclusive, the universal policies that create kind of a shared experience, build trust into the state, whereas populations, often, and this is something that's also true for informal workers, they tend to, we always assume that informal workers don't have any interactions with the state. They have lots of interaction with the state, but they're all punitive, right? So they only know the state as confiscating goods and services, demanding daily taxes. There is a lack of a positive experience about public services, about the state, but certainly about social protection. And one way to address that, and where a state can show that, kind of respect for individuals, for its citizen, is through social protection. And I think social protection can be useful in building that sort of contract and strengthening it. But I think it's equally important to know that it can also, there is some evidence that it can be quite harmful as well if we're, poverty targeting that's not understood well, or that is seen as divisive, can undermine social cohesion. Seeing your neighbor receive a cash transfer, but you don't receive it, and it's unclear why that's the case, not in line with maybe societal values. So I would say, well-designed, inclusive social protection can build that social contract. But I think making people jump through too many hoops, be it demeaning, conditionalities, I think is an interesting element here, since this is a gender social protection conversation, kind of making conditionality that place particular burden oftentimes on women to comply with in order to receive cash transfers, can also undermine, can provide opportunities for implementers and the state to engage in I don't know, can behave in ways that can undermine social coherence as well. So really design and implementation is hugely important. I don't know whether Silke has more to add. Anyway, I think this summer little report you should go through, but maybe I'm sure Silke has more to add.
Yeah, no, I agree with much of what you said, Florian. And in particular, maybe just to add, I think it's in those contexts in particular, it's not only the what, but it's the how that matters. And I think we have some research on that in conflict and post-conflict settings where, yes, social protection and public services could, rebuild trust in the state, strengthen social cohesion, but a lot depends on how they're implemented. If they're not seen as reliable, I think one of the studies and quotes we included in the report, trust arrives by foot, but it departs on a horseback. So if expectations are disappointed in these contexts, that can be harmful. And to link it maybe to the delivery theme, the frontline implementers, the social protection workers, the community health workers, they are the visible face of the state. They are what social protection recipients and most citizens experience of the state. That is their experience with the state. And so that is where the trust is built. And I think a lot of the emphasis in the gender responsive social protection world, and I think rightly so, is on training these workers, on understanding gender inequalities and gender issues and how to address them, etc. And that is really important, but it's only one part of a much bigger puzzle in terms of ensuring that sufficient staff is available, that, as Naila said, these staff feel like they're treated with respect and dignity and have the working conditions they need. We see that, in some really great studies, for example, on Peru, that when frontline implementers are overwhelmed by the restrictions they're given, for example, certain contingents of benefits that they can give in a local community, but the demand exceeding that, they come up with so-called shadow conditions. They make up their own eligibility criteria because that's the only way they can cope. And so it's those structural issues as well that need to be addressed because there's only so much even a very well-trained frontline implementer can do.
Thank you, Florian and Silke, for those last intervention points. So unfortunately, we now have to bring the webinar to a close. My apologies, Yolanda and Sophia, if we didn't answer your questions directly, but perhaps we can follow up after the webinar. I would just like to say a big congratulations again to Silke and the team for producing this excellent report and for your excellent presentation today. A warm thank you to all of our panelists for their incredible contribution to today's rich discussion as well. Also, thank you to all the organisers involved in this: UN Women, UNICEF, FCDO, HelpAge International, WeGo, and the SPIAC-B Gender Working Group, and of course to our socialprotection.org colleagues for all of their support for today's webinar. Lastly, thank you to all colleagues in the audience for joining us today and for your active participation and for your great questions. Please don't forget that the recording will be up online soon, so please do share it with others who couldn't make it today. And finally, please do take a minute now to fill out the survey that sp.org will send through the chat. And please let us all keep the conversation going in terms of our actions and discussions on strengthening gender transformative social protection. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca, for the great moderation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Silke. Bye.
Bye.